Hey everybody, Carl Larson here. Welcome back to part 2 of the cleverly named After Effects tutorial series entitled Building a Cube World in After Effects. We named it that because we're building a world out of cube faces in After Effects. Anyways, the important thing to know is that this process is powerful and it's free. So if you haven't watched part 1 of this series, stop now. Go back, watch it, and we'll be waiting for you. For everyone else, let's jump in where we left off. Welcome to part 2 of Building a Cube World in After Effects.
To speed up our performance, let's shut off that adjustment layer for now, and let's add a little text into our scene. Right now we're working with a square composition from when we imported the layers. Let's first go into the composition settings, and let's turn this into a broadcast standard HD size comp. So we'll go composition settings, and change our composition settings to 720p, so 1280 by 720. There we go. Alright, well now that since we resized our scene, it's become a little smaller as far as our viewing angle because we just made the whole scene narrower. So let's back up the view of the camera a little bit. With the POV anim cam selected, let's press AA on the keyboard. And let's just back off the zoom until we hit about 115 degrees of viewing angle. So we get a nice wide viewing angle for our scene. That way when we spin around, we'll get a little more dramatic effect. That's going to look nice. So now I think it's time to add in our text layers. We're going to add in 3 text layers: layer, new, text, and we'll call the first one main, all caps. We'll add another one, layer, new, text, street, all caps, and then we'll add one more, layer, new, text, and we'll call this economic outlook. There we go. Now what we're going to do in the final comp is leave economic outlook as a 2D layer, and I'll just shut that off for now, and then street and main will be 3D layers that rotate with our world. So let's turn those into 3D layers and grab the street layer and just pull it down using our move tool, V on the keyboard, and just spin it around a little bit. Using the W on the keyboard, or the rotate tool right up here, making sure that it's set for rotation instead of orientation, let's just grab it and kind of get it lined up with the tiles on the road. I think that's going to make it look like this sits in the scene a little bit better. C for our orbit tool, and let's spin around. Oh, that looks great. This is going to be really cool. Alright, well, what we should do is let's just define a quick camera movement for this so we can kind of set up the timing of the flourishes that are going to be on the text as well. This is going to be a relatively fast animation, so at about 12 frames or so, let's set our main camera position. And we'll select P, define a keyframe, go back to the beginning of the scene, orbit around, and now let's check out our move. And that's not what we predicted. Well, what's going on? Well, when After Effects does an animation, it will always choose the fastest point in between point A and point B. In this case, even though we use the orbit tool, it doesn't put the camera on a circular path. Instead, it moves from position 1 to position 2 in the fastest means possible, which means it's going to go right through the text. And I don't want to see that happen. That might be what you want, but I want to orbit around the text. So let's go back to our original position. We'll shut off our keyframes, and we'll find another solution. Instead of animating the camera, let's add another null to our scene. Layer, new, null object. We'll rename this, call it Camera Rotator, and make it a 3D layer. Then what we'll do instead of animating the camera is we'll make the camera rotate around this point. So with the camera selected, we'll take the parenting pick whip and parent it to the camera rotator. Now at 12 frames, we'll hit R to reveal the rotation properties of the camera rotator. And we want to be sure that we keyframe the rotation, not the orientation of the null. If we keyframe the orientation, it will go... You can't have predictable results if you go more than 180 degrees. So let's just be sure that we have predictable results and use a Y rotation, set a keyframe, go back to the beginning. We'll spin around maybe to 200 degrees or so. And now as we scrub back through, we get a nice orbit around our text. That's going to be great. Now let's go out to about 2.5 seconds or so, add just a little extra spin to this so it just doesn't kind of slam into that, but has a nice little rotation. And we'll just define our work area to be about 2.5 seconds here. It's going to be a fast animation. And we can right click on our work area and trim the comp to the work area. So now we've got just a 2.5 second animation, and I think this is going to look real nice. Now that looks pretty good, but it kind of slams into this position here. So let's select the rotation, open up our graph editor, and we'll open this up a bit so we can see what's going on. With the velocity is two distinct values. We have one speed, a keyframe, and a slower speed. So it's going fast, it's going slow, no transition, just bang right into that corner. So let's grab that keyframe and smooth it out by using the Auto Bezier command. And if we just leave the keyframe where it is, we're going to get some weird results. It's going to go slow, or it's going to go fast, slow down, and actually start traveling the other direction. So let's just grab this, push this up a little bit, so we get kind of a nice consistent rotation. It's going fast and eases into a slow position. That'll be nice. Scale this back down. And let's do a quick RAM preview of our scene. That'll look great. At about 10 frames or so, we're going to want that economic outlook layer to pop in. So it's just going to be a 2D layer that interacts with our 3D environment. So this is where we want it to begin the animation, but let's, at about 18 frames or so, let's select it, press P to define position value, and then we'll put it right where we want it. So we're going to make this a little lower, off to the side, and let's scale this down a little bit too. I think that's just too big. There we go, that's starting to look real good. Alright, so go back to 10 frames, we'll just slide it out of the side of the composition, and we'll select the last keyframe, hit F9 on the keyboard to have it ease in. Cool. Now let's continue just defining our text just a little bit more. So an economic outlook, I think that would look good with a little ramp on it. So let's go Effect, Generate, Ramp. There it is. And give it a black to white. We'll just grab the top of the ramp, put it at the top of the layer, grab the end of the ramp, put it at the bottom of the layer. Maybe we should switch those, just to give it something subtle. There we go, that'll look nice. We'll darken up our whole scene in a bit so our text stands out just a little bit more. But alright, now let's work on our main text layers. With street selected, let's go Layer, Precompose. We're going to do some work on this layer, and it's just going to be easier if we precompose it and do it in kind of its own scene. So move all attributes to new composition. Let's call this Street Text Precomp. Hit OK. And this position changes in our scene, but we can fix that in a little bit. So let's go Option, click on Street Text Precomp to get into the precomp here. Let's turn on Transparency Grid so we can see what we're doing. We'll scale this layer up to fill up our scene a little bit, and then we'll just redo things in our main comp. As far as the rotation, let's just leave it flat, and then we'll rotate the precomp later. One thing you'll notice is the text just really doesn't stand out. So let's go Effect with the layer selected. We'll go Effect, Perspective, Drop Shadow. And we want to soften this up quite a bit. And we'll increase the opacity to about 75% or so as well. We want this to be fairly distinct. And the distance, 6 or 7, I think that'll look good. Okay. Your layer's just a little too large, but we can always fix that after the fact. So there we go. Now let's add a couple different flourishes into the scene just to make it a little more lively. So I'm going to use a couple of flourishes from Andrew Kramer's Evolution series and just bring them into our scene to give them a little more life. So we'll just keep things organized here and call these flourishes. Let's drop in flourish 11 as a starting point. And you won't see anything because these all animate on. And they're pretty huge, which is great. So just so we can see what we're doing, let's go Effect, Generate, Fill, and make it black. This is how it's going to appear in the final comp. Next thing we need to do is scale this down so we can see it. And let's scale it down until somewhere around 20%, I think is going to serve us well. Alright, so we'll move this up to the top of the second E or so. Leave it unrotated. I think that'll look nice. So that'll just grow in the corner there. Let's add another flourish. So going back into our project, we'll grab flourish 12, bring that into our scene. We want to keep all these below our text layer. So there again, let's go Effect, Fill. We can use that from before. Change it to black. And hit OK. Again, we'll scale it down. And we'll move it over in our scene, kind of in between the S and the T. Now, things are starting to get a little misaligned, so we'll just grab everything and move it all down so we have room in our scene. This is why we're working in a pre-comp. It's just going to be a little easier to work with everything in our final composition if we do some pre-comping here. So that's looking good. Let's just say 50% for the scale. Now I want to add just one more flourish to this, and then we'll play with the timing. So I'm actually going to use flourish 12 again. We'll duplicate that, and this time we'll put it in between the E and the T, and then press S, and we will flip this one over, so we'll go minus 50 this time. And as we scrub through, that'll look good. Now let's just rotate this a little bit. So we'll rotate it to 270 degrees, kind of up here, I think. And then we'll turn all the layers into 3D layers. Grab the position property for those and just push them back a little bit. Now let's switch back to our main comp and see what happened. So looking at our main comp, now we've got a fairly large layer going on, and what we need to do to get our 3D information from our pre-comp to come into our main scene, we need to turn this into a 3D layer and turn on collapse transformation. So it looks at the information from the previous scene. So now when we affect the rotation of this, everything will kind of sit in our scene the way it ought to, which is nice. So we're just going to take this whole scene and scale it down a little bit. That's looking pretty good there. And now we'll do the same thing for the main pre-comp and see how that goes. So select the main layer, go Layer, Precompose, move all attributes to new composition. We'll call this main text pre-comp. And we'll open a new composition, hit OK, and we'll do the same thing. We'll turn off our transparency grid, scale this up so it fills up the whole screen. We'll affect perspective, drop shadow, increase that distance to 7, the softness to about 30. Move this down in our composition. We'll just center it up by pressing the quotation bracket. We can kind of toggle on our grid, make sure it's kind of centered up on our composition. And we'll add in one final flourish here. We'll grab flourish 07, bring it into our scene. And again, it's large. We'll go Effect, Generate Fill, turn it black. And now we can scale this down to about 30% or so. There we go. And in the other layers, when we turn them to 3D, we pushed it in back of the layer. We're going to put this one in front. So we'll go Position, we'll grab a minus value, and just have it sit a little bit above our scene. Now back in our main composition, we'll grab the main text pre-comp and we'll scale this down to something a little more appropriate. Again, we have to turn it into a 3D layer, turn on collapse transformations, and we can scale this down. That looks pretty good. And just change the position of it a little bit. And see how these interact. That's looking really nice. Alright, well, our background still just doesn't look quite right, but we're getting a whole lot closer. I'll do a quick RAM preview just so we can kind of see how things are developing here. So that looks great. So I think what we may want to do is just go into our street pre-comp, and it looks like these come on a little late. So we'll just go back into our street text pre-comp real quick, and we'll slide flourish 12, both of them, just forward a couple frames, just so they're really kind of into the scene before we're done with the animation here. So that's going to look a little bit more complete, I think. And just slide them back a hair. So slide them forward somewhere around 17, 11 frames, something like that. We can even offset them a little bit so they don't animate on exactly at the same time. That's going to look really good. Alright, now back in the main comp, not the main text pre-comp, let's go to our final position and see what we can do to make our scene focus more on the text and not the brightness of the scene itself. So let's grab all of our layers, hit U to collapse them, and let's turn on our adjustment layer that we were using for color earlier. Hit F2 to deselect, grab our adjustment layer, and let's see what we can do with these adjustment controls. Let's reset both of them so we can see what the scene looks like without any adjustment. And now what we're going to do is just really darken up our scene. I want to kind of crush the blacks, bring up the brights, and that's going to be a little too crushed, so just bring that up, get a nice S-curve going on, and then we'll go into each individual channel. We want it to kind of look dark and nasty, so we're going to get rid of some of the reds, and then we're going to pump the green, and add a little curve to the blue as well. So it looks kind of cold, looks kind of uninviting. I think that red needs to be flattened out just a little bit. So that looks pretty dark and scary. And now we just, in our hue saturation, let's take down the saturation quite a bit. I want to really focus just on the scene itself. Maybe even just darken it. Darken all of it there. So switching back to the RGB, let's maybe back off the blacks on that just a little bit, and we can just keep tweaking that until it looks right. So a couple final more things we can do is, as long as we're working on the color, let's add a vignette to our scene. So we'll layer, new, solid. We'll take a dark blue solid, make it comp size, add it to our scene, put it on the very top of the stack. With our mask tool selected, let's grab the ellipse tool, double click it, and create an elliptical mask on our scene. Now pressing MM on the keyboard, let's switch our mask to subtract so we have it along the edges. Feather the edges about 250 pixels, and then change the transfer mode to classic color burn. That'll just kind of darken up the edges. Now that's pretty extreme there, so let's just back that off a little bit. Pressing T reveals the opacity, and let's bring that down to about 30% or so. Alright, so this is starting to look pretty good, kind of dark, kind of grungy, and let's move this below our text just so our text really stands out. There we go. So one final thing we may want to add to our scene is motion blur. This is just a way to kind of make everything look like it really sits and lives in the scene. Normally what we do is we grab all of our layers, activate the motion blur switch, and then turn on global motion blur. But since we're using kind of an interesting system here, we're going to end up with some lines in the seams of our scene if we leave those on. So this isn't going to be the approach that we want to do. Instead, let's add one more final adjustment layer and see how we can make this work. So F2 to deselect everything, layer, new, adjustment layer, and we're going to add CC force motion blur. There it is, CC force motion blur. Just drag that onto our scene, and on the adjustment layer, let's just hit return and name it blur. Now using CC Force Motion Blur, it looks at the frames before and after the frame that you're on to determine how much each pixel has moved. And therefore it's going to ignore the alpha channel because it's looking at a rendered version. So it's a little steppy. We can turn that up to maybe 16 or 32 steps to get a little smoother motion blur as we were experiencing before, and render out our final scene. One thing to keep in mind is that this is kind of a render intense application. So Only do this in your final render. It might be a little too intense for you, but let's just kind of see how this goes. It's a slow render, and we'll try it out here. So do a final RAM preview and check out our scene. And that's looking great. I think that's really very, very close to what we want to do here. So I'm going to call this composition final. And let's just do a couple more cleanup things here before we say goodbye at the end of this tutorial. Well, one thing you probably noticed is that this takes just a hair longer than simply importing an image into your scene and applying Trapcode Horizon, and that's why it's a great plugin. But one way we can get around that, like I said at the beginning of this tutorial, there are a couple advantages that this technique uses that we haven't even yet explored, which I'll show you in another tutorial. So hang on for that. But in the meantime, this is a free option for you, so depending on your economic outlook, this might be what you want to do regardless. Back in the project, I do want to show you that once we've done this once, it's very easy to switch out our layers. And what I've done is I've gone ahead and created a template for you. So all we need to do from here is simply grab our layers. You don't have to reinvent this setup every single time you want to use it. Instead, you can just go into your source layers and do this very quickly. So we'll just grab the top layer in our scene, find the top layer cube face, hit Option to replace it, and do the same for the rest of the scene. So bottom goes to bottom, Option drag. Front goes to front. Back goes to back. The left goes to the left. And the right goes to the right. And now, you got a fully functional cube set up in just a matter of seconds versus 20 minutes of explanation and setup. So I hope you found this tutorial useful, and you can apply some of these techniques to your own projects.
Until next time, I'm Carl Larson for CreativeCow.net.